Hello, my name is Adrian on behalf of VP Research. Welcome to a Learn segment with supply and demand. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. So supply and demand is perhaps one of the most popular and most important concepts within economics. That is for many different reasons, mostly because it's useful for determining market price and quantity under any market condition, be it perfect competition or monopoly. Visualizing shifts and the effects of market shocks or moves, and in advanced economics, the addition of marginal revenue, marginal cost, and average total cost makes the model more accurate to real-world applications. In its basic form, supply and demand is simply a visualization of how producers and consumers act with respect to price and quantity. This is visualized by these two curves, the supply curve and the demand curve. So let's talk about the law of demand first, which is what the demand curve is based off. The law of demand states the quantity demanded will decrease with increases in price and vice versa, ceteris paribus. Usually the demand curve represents a negative correlation between price and quantity and takes the form of a negatively sloped curve, as depicted. The demand curve tends to shift due to consumer attitudes or changes in supplement or complement goods, which can also shift the supply curve. Examples of shifts are the price of a complement good changes, the price of a supplement good changes, changes in consumer income, and changes in consumer attitudes or taste. The first, when we refer to a complement good, we refer to a good which is meant to go together with our main good. For example, think of ice cream and a cone, or hot dog and mustard. For supplement goods, we mean the inverse of that, in which a good is rival to our main good. For this, think of Apple and Samsung, and Ford and Chevy. Changes to consumer income are relatively straightforward, and changes in consumer attitudes or taste represent a product which can fall in or out of popularity. Moving on to the law of supply. The law of supply states that a supplier will increase the amount of goods or services with an increase in price, ceteris paribus. On the graph, the supply curve takes the form of a positively sloped curve with varying elasticities, as such. Similar to the demand curve, the supply curve is also subject to shifts, but for different reasons. The supply curve typically shifts due to changes in factors of production. So a few examples can be a new manufacturing plant for a firm is opened and a greater quantity is capable of being achieved at a relatively lower price, or vice versa, which is typically referred to as economies of scale. The cost of a good in the production process either gets cheaper or more expensive, in extreme circumstances unavailable, or there are more or less manufacturers introduced into a market. To fully understand these concepts, let's take a look at a few examples. The first question being, a local manufacturing plant gives raises to its workers. What will occur to the demand curve in the local market for automobiles? Breaking down this question, we see that the market for automobiles does not experience any direct shift due to a change in the automotive industry, but rather potential customers experience an increase in income. As a result, the willingness to pay for people in the local market has increased. Increases in willingness to pay will result in the demand curve shifting to the right or positively, as we can depict on the graph. Taking a look at another example, rubber experiences a global shortage. What happens to the supply curve in the local automotive industry in Detroit? The automotive industry sees a change in supply of an important material used in car manufacturing. As a result, either the automotive industry sees an increase in price for rubber, but with the same supply, or an overall decrease in the supply of rubber with no price change. Both of these scenarios have a negative impact on production. There is not enough materials to produce the same amount of units as before, or there is an increase in price of the overall product due to a price change. As such, the demand curve will shift to the left, bringing quantity down but price up. Moving on to another example, Assume the price of Apple smartphones decreases and the demand for Samsung phones decrease. What happens to the quantity and price of Samsung phones? In this example, Samsung and Apple are supplement goods, meaning the increase in price for one will increase the demand for another, even as stated in the example. Since we are given that the demand for Samsung phones decreases, we know that the demand curve shifted to the left. On the graph we see that the equilibrium price and quantity decrease. Moving on to another example, cotton is now being farmed at a greater rate than ever before due to a recently discovered method of cultivation. What happens to the equilibrium price and quantity for the market of shirts? In this example, we see that cotton has experienced an increase in production due to innovations in farming. We can assume that either the price for cotton falls or the quantity supplied of cotton has increased. In both cases, we see the supply curve shift to the right. In doing so, we can see the new equilibrium has a lower price but higher quantity than the original equilibrium. The previous question mentioned the concept of equilibrium. Equilibrium is where the supply and demand curve intersect. Equilibrium in this case refers to the most efficient output. This is the case because of the maximization of total surplus, which of course means there is no waste, such as deadweight loss. Total surplus is the area to the left of the supply and demand curve and is comprised of producers and consumer surplus. More in-depthly, producer surplus is the monetary gain from selling a product at a higher price than they were willing to sell it at. As we move along each point in the supply curve, we see that it intersects with numerous points. First here at 4 and 4, meaning the firm was willing to produce 4 units at a price of 4. But that is inefficient to do so. Instead, the firm moves to produce quantity E, which in this case is 10. As such, shifts the price to 11. So instead of receiving merely 4, it is now receiving a price of 11 for each product. This entire region represents that increase in price. Conversely, consumer surplus denotes the monetary gain of consumers that were able to buy a product at a lower price than they were willing to pay for it. Same concept. Consumers were willing to pay for a price here with a quantity of 3, but a price of 18. Rather, due to there being equilibrium in this market, the new price was 10 with a new price of 11. This area denotes the money that they saved from being able to purchase it at $11 versus 18. In this, we have deadweight loss, which decreases both of these surpluses. Deadweight loss occurs if the market price or quantity equilibrium is not achieved or is unattainable. Deadweight loss is found on the graph as the section between quantity produced and the equilibrium, with the supply and demand curves serving as constraints. Let's look at an example for equilibrium. Given the supply and demand curve to the right, assume the firm has recently launched a marketing campaign promoting their products as the newest innovation on the market. The campaign successfully generated enthusiasm for the product, resulting in the demand curve shifting to the right by 4. Draw and state the effects on the supply and demand curve and state the new equilibrium price and quantity. This question holds a lot of information, and it is best for anyone to look at that information one by one. Most importantly here, we see that the demand curve is shifting, and it is to the right and by 4. This is a lot of information and all the information we really need. The question itself gives us that the demand curve is shifting, which if it wasn't for that, we might assume that the supply curve was shifting. As such, we can start from the equilibrium point here and move to the right 4. that would leave us at a point here, which if we create the general outline for a line, we see that a new point is created. This new point, where it intersects with the supply curve, is our new equilibrium. Cleaning it up, we can see here that the equilibrium has shifted to 11 and 12, with the demand curve obviously shifting to the right. Let's move on to an example for consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. Given the graph to the right, calculate the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. This graph is loaded with new information, including the coordinates for where the graphs end. This is very important. However, we could have just counted it regardless. This is where our consumer and producer surplus will be capped, with this area being the consumer surplus and this area being the producer surplus. On the next graph, we can see that this area is very difficult to find the area for without an equation. So we would have to use the points. Seeing that we are given all these points, we can easily figure out that this length is 7 and this length is also 7. This length being 4 and this length being 3. Splitting these two sections apart, we can make it drastically easier to find the areas. Using the equations for an area of a rectangle, which is base times height, we can see that the area of this rectangle is 21. Similarly, we see that the area for a triangle up next is 1/2 base times height, which we see the base and height are both 7, giving us a value of 49, which divided by 2 will give us 24.5. Moving on to producer surplus, base times height of this rectangle will give us 28. For the triangle, we can see that this area is 42. Divide that by 2 is equal to 21. All we have to do now is add each of these two together to get their respective amounts. For consumer surplus, that comes out to 45.5, and for producer surplus, that comes out to 49. Total surplus is just the sum of both of these two metrics, which comes out to 94.5. That will conclude this lesson. If you learned something, please remember to give us a like, comment, and subscribe. We do take requests, so if you have any concept you would like explored or clarified, we will be more than happy to do that for you. Be sure to visit EP Research's main website to discover all we have to offer. That link will be found in the description. Thank you, we hope you learned something, and we'll see you in the next one.